Morality versus legality. Can morals and laws be different? Let's talk about that.
And it's really simple because if you start with the wrong perspective, you'll make the wrong choice. I'm not out to hurt anyone's feelings, but between politically correct or correct, I'll choose the last.
Hello and welcome to the Chris F. Walker Podcast. I am Chris F. Walker. Thank you so very much for spending some of your time with me here today. It means a great deal to me, and I'm very, very happy that you chose to spend a little bit of your precious time with me. If you're following us on YouTube, go ahead and hit that subscribe button down there below and share this with your friends, because sometimes it's great to get some perspectives on some of these topics that are not my own. It's great to seek out other perspectives and see what other people have to say about things like this. But what are we talking about today? Morals and laws. You know, it's interesting because I've heard it said a lot of times that there's a difference between morality and legality, meaning just because it's legal doesn't mean it's right. I can agree with that. Or maybe just because it can be done doesn't mean it should be done, meaning moral, and I can agree with that. But the real question is there really a separation between morality and legality? And more importantly, what does that really mean in terms of a Christian worldview? And that's what we're going to be talking about today as we dive into some of these concepts. So what I want to start with first is I want to kind of lay the groundwork by talking a little bit about a scenario, and we're going to use it as a way to pull out some of the analogies that we need. Okay, so the scenario is this. We're going to say that there's a major natural disaster at a major city near you. Maybe if you're in Los Angeles, it was an earthquake, or maybe if you're in New Orleans, it was a hurricane, or you get the point. Major natural disaster. Now, in the process after this natural disaster, there's a huge amount of chaos. What you have is you have a gentleman who's going around and he's looting local stores. Okay? So in one scenario, he's going to be looting television sets because he knows that eventually, all this stuff's going to subside and he's going to have all these TVs and he could probably sell them and hawk them and get some money out of it. And the other one is a guy who's raiding and looting a grocery store or two, and he's grabbing things like milk or bread or, things like that, and he's helping distribute the food to people who need it, especially for his own family. So in terms of legality and morality, right and wrong, we need to address how all of this plays out. So let's start with actually addressing what is, okay? Legally, is it wrong to take the TV sets? Yes. Looting is against the law. Morally, is it wrong to take the TV sets? Not according to the guy who's doing it, because according to him, he's getting his and, and some people would even say, hey, good on you to each your own. But if you're the guy who owns those TV sets, you're probably feeling a little bit violated. So there was some moral grounds in there that we have to contest with. Okay, but most of the time, people would look at the TV set scenario and say, okay, he's not morally right to be doing that. Okay, but then we turn around and we talk about the guy who's doing it from the grocery store. Morally, is it right? He needs food. His family's dying. There's people around him that are in need, and he's helping them. He's taking the food that he's taking and he's giving it to people to help make sure that they're fed. Well, morally, there's a lot of good in that. But as far as the legality factor, is he still looting? Yes. He still took it, and it wasn't his property. Neither did he pay for it to make it his property. That means it's looting. He's guilty of breaking the law. Well, as we determine what's right and wrong, we ultimately have to decide, are we going to err on the side of morality or are we going to err on the side of legality? But is there really a way to make sure that everything is appeased? And in a Christian worldview, in a Judeo-Christian worldview, there actually is. Those both matter. And if you really want to understand the idea of legality in relation to morality, understand this, because a lot of people, especially with the arguments I just used, mine are all, these two scenarios are hypotheticals, and they directly come at one side or the other. But what they forgot to do was derive backwards to where both of those came from to determine if they're actually related or not. And here's how I mean by that. Is it morally right to take something that is not yours? We all know from the time of being a child, you shouldn't do that. Our parents have to teach us over and over again, don't take things that don't belong to you. But we want them. That's in our nature. We want to have these things. So the reason laws exist at all is to create a means by which morality can be enforced upon a society. The problem with that is that a lot of the time society is that's going to be making their own laws, obviously. And so, for example, in Nazi Germany, it was not illegal for any of the government officials to execute Jews for any reason at all. Well, morally, we know that's wrong. Legally, there was no issue with that. And they had to overcome a lot of moral obstacles in order to create a system where that was now legal. And there's a lot of evil in studying how the Nazi Party was able to kind of skew a lot of people's morality in order to subjugate some people and even execute others. And it was all for the benefit of another group of people. Don't forget that, is that as we do look at some of these moralities and legalities, someone's the beneficiary. That's where these things come from. And that's honestly why the American Constitution, back when the Founding Fathers wrote it, was so fixated on finding a means that would make sure that just because you're the majority doesn't mean you have the ability to trump on the rights of even the minority. They wanted to make sure that all the way down to the individual, there are certain things cannot be done by the government to you because they're morally right. And even if they they decided to make laws that would safeguard those. So morality and legality are actually very, very intertwined. And how that plays out is very crucial to how we then view our own belief system. So stick around because I want to dive into that just in a little bit more detail as soon as we come back, okay?
Please don't forget to follow and review the show today. Also, head over and register at the chrisfwalker.com website. There you'll find links to the Indiegogo and Patreon campaigns which help keep this show going. You'll also find links to the bookstore, gear shop, blog, and you'll stay up to date on upcoming events and live appearances. Now, let's get back to today's message.
And welcome back. Thank you so much for joining me. It is so fun to get to be here and talk with you guys today. So obviously we're talking about morality and legality and how they actually combine together. Now the first scenarios that we ran in just at the beginning, we talked about one was a guy who was looting after a natural disaster to gain TV sets for the sake of basically self-gain. And then the other was a guy who was looting after a natural disaster in order to gain food and perishables so that he could feed other people, including himself. Don't get me wrong, he's probably going to eat too, but he's doing it for the purpose of this. So how exactly does morality and legality play out in a Christian worldview? And more importantly, how do we make sure that certain things are done correctly? And that's where it becomes very hard. Because the hard part is not necessarily in the understanding. The hard part is in legitimately executing both sides of the spectrum. How do we account for law and how do we account for morals without trampling on the rights of even the individual? And that's been an argument since ancient Greece has been trying to decide how a democracy should work. The Roman republics were trying to figure out how that stuff should work. And it is the foundational principle behind the entire American governmental viewpoint. So how exactly does this play out? Well, I'm going to use those same scenarios and try to explain it. In the context of the guy taking the TV sets, what happens is when we find out he broke the law, we want to punish him because he shouldn't have done that. And the way he is punished is going to be in somehow recompensing the person he wronged, meaning the person who owned those TV sets that he took. So it'll be the job of the person not only who took it to spend whatever time is going to be required by the judge in prison as a punishment to say don't do that, but he's also going to be required to pay back what was supposed to be recompense for the goods that were taken. And in some cases, that's not even possible, which is why insurance companies are what they are, because they understand that sometimes you're not going to get your recovery back. So how sad is it that we have to actually put money up front into programs that will help us recover what other people took, knowing that they're never going to give it back. And we're incapable of actually forcing that out of them because you can You can sit there and you can actually go old school and stone them if you want. You're never going to get your TV sets back. So the problem with all of that legality there is that one's pretty easy, cut and dry. The guy broke it. Now, morally, the guy who takes the TV, he's not thinking he's morally wrong. And even if he is thinking it, he doesn't care, because what he's thinking of is, what is the gain? What is the selfish gain I'm going to get out of this? And he might even be doing it selflessly in his mind, because that money he's going to get from that, he might go and help other people with. But he still took it from someone who it wasn't his to begin with. Does that make sense? So when I then turn around and we say, okay, well, what about the food? This other guy, he's stealing, let's say, milk or bread. These are things that are perishable. They're going to spoil anyway. No one's going to get to use them. But now at least someone, before they go bad, is going to get the chance to consume them, and they're going to help. So legally, we still have this problem, though. They were not his property. So how do we accommodate for that? The reality is he still broke the law. So he has to be held accountable. Now, what does that accountability look like? Ultimately, it really comes down to the person he took it from. If the person who owned the milk, who owned the bread, prior to it being stolen, turns around and says, I understand why you did it. I might even have done that myself. And what I'm choosing to do is forgive that offense. Now, it doesn't change that you broke the law. You are still guilty of breaking the law. The difference now is that the punishment is not yours anymore. But does that mean the punishment's gone? No. So what about the shopkeeper who needs to restock his shelves with milk and bread? You see, he doesn't get any of the proceeds from the sales that he used to make. As people would buy the milk and bread, he would take the proceeds and buy more milk and bread. And so that's the nature of his business. And, he doesn't get that this time. Hopefully he got insurance as well. So I know this is actually starting to turn into what sounds like an insurance sales pitch, but it's not. I'm just trying to point out that's what insurance is supposed to be for, is to kind of fill in these gaps. But the point is that even if he forgave the debt that the other person took the milk and bread, he is still going to have to pay that the price to actually put those things back on the shelf. The price is still going to get paid. Okay? So he might be willing to forgive it, but that means he had to take the price onto himself. And some of you already know where I'm going with this now. So how does this play out in terms of morality and legality, in terms of a Christian worldview? In Christian worldview, the reason why laws must be upheld, you cannot let go of the law, is because enforcement has to be something that is absolute. Now, where those laws come from derive from a moral viewpoint that we can all agree on, and if we're lucky, we won't really have to argue it too much. But we understand that life is not cut and dry, so there's going to be some variance in there. So how exactly do we do that as a Christian worldview? Is that we'll be willing to forgive. And as the Bible teaches us, it's because we're willing to forgive as we have been forgiven. Because let's think about this one now. Let's go directly at the heart of it. If humankind broke laws that were set by God, then there has to be an accountability factor and there has to be a price paid. But morally, maybe we are still trying to accomplish the good things that are in our heart, even though we still have bad in our heart too. And lucky for us, we have a judge that understands that it's our human nature that tends to force us to do wrong things. Well, force is the wrong word. We choose to do it. Again, we chose, just like the guy can choose to take the TV sets, and the guy could have chosen not to take the bread. But sometimes we choose to do things, even if we think it's right, and it could possibly be wrong. So that grace area is where we then find the idea of a God coming down from heaven himself, entering into human form, putting himself up onto a cross to pay the penalty for sins he never committed, because the price still has to get paid, so that the forgiveness can then be passed to us. Now, that means it would account for the legality of sin. The price was paid. It would count for the morality of God seeking a relationship with us and us truly understanding that yearning that we have in our hearts for something more that we never really quite fill when we seek things like money or new things or conquest over different people. That void that's never quite filled is usually, once people come to understand it, that's the draw to want to be with a relationship with God. And God knows that. That's why He made us. He made us to have that relationship. So He understands that, which means that in order to morally account for any of that grace that's in there, He not only took the penalty on Himself, but He did so in a way that would account for the law. So He accounts for morality and legality. And why would He do it? And that's the coolest part. Selfless love. And we're going to talk about that in probably the next podcast is going to be talking a little bit about the Trinity and some of the relational values in some of these things. But the point is, morality and legality in terms of how Christian worldview works are both required. And if you understand them both, you can start understanding the point of the crucifixion. And the other nice thing about that, though, is it helps us then turn around and understand that how we live as a society does revolve around not only making good moral choices, but still being accountable to the law. So, for example, at the end, let's say you're the gentleman who was taking the milk and the bread. It's very possible that you took it for all the right moral reasons, but you still broke the law. And so instead, you go back to the shopkeeper. You confess, I took this bread, I took this milk, I didn't have the means to pay for it. It was going bad and I didn't want it to spoil when I know people could have used it. So forgive me, I am guilty of this, but I also throw myself at your feet. I can beg for forgiveness, but the reality is it's still his property and he has the choice whether or not you're supposed to pay it back or not. And here's the hard part as a Christian. If he chooses that you're supposed to repay that debt, you're going to have to, because that's what's morally right. It's what's legally right. And it might be something that everyone else looks at the other guy and says, you're just a cold, heartless, and he might be. But it doesn't change that his property was taken and he was the one wrong. So we have to account for both legality and morality as we make our decisions in life. And I wish it was as simple as that, because if you look at a lot of the political debates going on, it's obviously anything but simple. But understanding both those concepts can probably help you try to maybe make your points a little bit clearer as you try to express your viewpoints in the future with other people. Just like if you have any viewpoints that are contrary to mine, throw them in the comments below. I'd love to hear them and love to explore them. But for now, I want to thank you all for joining me. God bless each and every one of you. Can't wait to see you again next time. Take care.
I realize your time is the most precious commodity you could possibly share with anyone. So I want to thank you again for spending some of yours here with me today. Don't forget to review the message for others. And be sure to follow the Chris F. Walker podcast for new releases. Remember, your generous support on sites like Indiegogo and Patreon are making this show possible. Don't forget to register at the chrisfwalker.com website for links to the bookstore, gear shop, and to stay updated for new events and appearances. I hope to see you again soon. God bless.